The Barn in the Field. Chapter 1. A tradition of land and life in the heart of Ohio. There was a wealthy farmer, known not only for his vast lands, but for a peculiar and deeply personal tradition. Each time he and his wife had a child, he would build a new barn on their property to honor the newborn. Each barn stood as a testament to his growing family, a symbol of his love and dedication to the life he had built. Over the years, 6 barns were constructed, each more elaborate than the last. The barns were a reflection of the farmer's success, and his family, once large and full of promise, was a source of pride. The quiet town where the farm was located whispered tales of the family's prosperity. They were admired, envied, and respected by all who lived nearby. But things began to change when the 7th child was expected. The farmer, eager to continue his tradition, began making plans for the next barn. He had already sketched out the design for what would be the grandest barn of all, one that would be a tribute to the joy and hope the new child would bring. But fate had other plans. Chapter 2. The tragic loss. The birth of the 7th child, however, was not to be a cause for celebration. During the delivery, both the mother and child tragically passed away. The event shattered the farmer, driving him into a deep, sorrowful depression. The once strong and capable man was now reduced to a shell of his former self, racked with grief and guilt. His wife's death, compounded by the loss of the child, was more than he could bear. Unable to cope with the loss of his family, the farmer withdrew from the community. His grief consumed him. The farms he had so lovingly tended to began to fall into disrepair, and the once thriving business began to spiral downward. He was unable to manage the debts that were rapidly mounting, and his fortune, once a symbol of success, began to crumble. Chapter 3. A descent into madness. The farmer's mind, already fragile from years of hard work, began to unravel. He became obsessed with the idea that the death of his wife and child was his fault, that somehow he had failed them. As the weight of his failures bore down on him, he began hearing voices. They whispered in the dead of night, calling him a failure, blaming him for the tragedy. One night, in the grip of his madness, he took an axe to the 6 barns he had built for his children. In a fit of rage and sorrow, he slaughtered them all, one by one, before burying their bodies in the barns he had once built with love. Each barn, once a symbol of life, now became a tomb for his children. He moved methodically, the act of murder seeming almost ritualistic. With each swing of the axe, his mind shattered further, until there was no more thought of redemption, only the cold, dark embrace of guilt. Chapter 4. The final barn. Once his children were gone, the farmer's sanity broke completely. In the depths of his grief and despair, he made his way to the 7th barn, the one he had never finished. It stood there, unfinished, much like the dreams he once had for his family. The barn was a dark place now, the site of all his hopes and regrets. In the silence of the night, with nothing left to live for, the farmer hung himself in the rafters of the unfinished barn. His body swayed gently, a grim reminder of the loss and madness that had consumed him. The barn, the last one, was the only structure that remained standing, as if the weight of his sins had caused all others to collapse. Chapter 5. The haunting begins. As time passed, the once thriving farm was abandoned, left to decay along with the farmer's memory. But the barn remained. People in the town began to speak of strange occurrences near the barn. Those brave enough to venture near it at night would hear strange noises, footsteps, whispers, the sound of an axe swinging through the air. Some claimed they saw the figure of the farmer hanging from the rafters, his lifeless body swaying as though he had only recently ended his life. His ghost, they said, never left the barn. It wandered the fields, appearing to those who dared to trespass. Locals swore that the barn was cursed, a place where the farmer's vengeful spirit lingered, forever tormented by the children he had murdered. They said the barn wasn't just a place, it was a gateway to something darker, something far beyond death. Chapter 6. The Return. One evening, a curious group of teenagers, drawn by the stories they had heard, decided to explore the barn. The night was cold, and the moonlight barely filtered through the thick trees that surrounded the farm. As they made their way toward the barn, they felt a strange unease, as if the air itself was thick with something malevolent. When they reached the barn, they found it exactly as the stories had described. Tall, dark, and imposing, its wooden planks worn and weathered by time. The door creaked as they pushed it open, and the stench of decay filled their noses. Inside, the barn was cold and empty, but the heavy air felt alive, pulsing with a strange energy. The teenagers explored the barn, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. As they ventured deeper inside, they noticed something strange scratches on the walls, as if something had tried to escape. The beams overhead seemed to groan, almost as if the barn itself were alive. Suddenly, one of the teenagers, Sarah, screamed. Her flashlight fell to the ground, and the others rushed to her side. She was standing at the far end of the barn, staring wide-eyed at something in the shadows. In the corner, barely visible in the dim light, stood the figure of a man. His face was gaunt and pale, his eyes hollow. The teenager could see the noose still around his neck, his body swaying slightly. "You shouldn't have come," the figure rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "You'll never leave." As the teenagers ran out of the barn, they could hear the sound of an axe swinging behind them, the whispers of the farmer following them as they fled into the night.